Cloud and
I'm doing teacher relations at Feedback Fruits, which means documenting the best practices of our users around the world who've been using our tools in their courses, seeing what they're doing well and sharing those inspiring stories with everyone I can. And right now I'm also doing a podcast, the Learning Experience Lab, where I'm talking to pioneers and innovators around the world to see what they're doing with education and technology. And that's me.
And I guess I will go next. My name is Moses. I'm actually originally from California, as you can see behind me, but I've been in the Netherlands for almost 10 years now. And I'm working with Feedback Fruits in business development. And I'm here to give you a great demonstration on some of our tools.
Nee?
Yes. Hi everyone. My name is Nee, and I'm also calling from Hilversum in the Netherlands, and I'm a part of the content team for Feedback Fruits, and I'm here to support in the chat, and then try to look at the questions that you have during the presentation and try to answer them. Yeah. And then I think next would be Ewout.
Hello. So good, whatever time of the day. I'm Ewout, co-founder, CEO of Feedback Fruits, and I'm also very honored to be able to introduce Irmak, who's on the team, who's in our marketing team. And indeed, we're a Dutch-based company in Amsterdam, but as you could see, there's lots of different nationalities in our team, and I think that's fantastic. That's how you can learn. But okay, for today, I want to introduce the topic of today, which is foster asynchronous collaboration in critical thinking with instructional technology or pedagogical technology, so to say. So Moses, if you could go to the next slide. So what we will be talking about today is, oh no, first of all, yes, hello from Amsterdam, as said. Well, I think we've gone through this. Amsterdam is very beautiful. It's also very small, but if you happen to be there, please come and join. We have a fantastic office on one of the canals. Moses, please continue. So what we want to talk about today is the importance of innovation in course design. That I will take. Then we'll talk about student engagement and that challenge of how to engage student engagement, how to spark student engagement. We will show a specific use case and do an actual demo of one of the tools from our tool suite. All right, Moses. Let's go to the next slide. So let me introduce, sorry, previous one. Yeah. So let me introduce basically why we started Feedback Fruits at the beginning. Because once upon a time, universities were this natural stepping stone for future leaders. Universities were the place where future leaders were prepared to take on the responsibilities that they have in our societies, especially in our democratic societies. However, that natural monopoly of universities is at risk. If you could go to the next slide. What we will find is that, first of all, companies are starting to hire more and more on skills over degrees. So if you could go, please just follow my line of, yeah, thank you. So first of all, companies are starting to hire more and more on skills over degrees. This means that this natural monopoly that universities used to have is degrading there. Second of all, we find more and more competition that's facing institutions, from online courses, commercial companies that take on universities. And third, the third monopoly that universities used to have was the monopoly on attention. Except for the coffee and the beers, you went to study in the past decades. However, that attention economy has also taken its toll on higher education. And we think that this is a tremendous challenge. And the core reason why this is a challenge is because universities do more than only equipping students with some skills to do their job. They equip students for lifelong learning and with the tools to think, like critical thinking, empathy, being able to understand someone's arguments, even though you might not have the same opinion. So in democratic societies where we rely on these skills, it's the institution of a university that should develop them. So this is why Feedback Fruits is committed to help make sure that university education stays extremely relevant. So if you could go to the next slide, Moses. So what we are about, mainly what we have found is that we are part of a pedagogical transformation that's actually driven by technology. But we should not be, we should be led by the pedagogical innovation and not led by technology. It's the student that should be in the central element of this learning experience. And sometimes at some institutions that we engage with, they might have forgotten that element, that this learning design where students are central is a core thing. And again, education should be skill focused, inclusive, and reflective. If you could go to the next slide, Moses. So the challenges and opportunities that we see is this digital transformation, right? Hybrid and online learning is here to stay, but let's make sure that then that online learning is indeed a better way of learning. Education move towards equity, inclusiveness, and diversity. This is something that we were just referring to Portland. We see a lot of challenges, I guess, where education can come up with a solution. And teaching is about a reflective practice. Like, it's encouraging feedback and progress. Like, the core of learning is getting feedback on your learning trajectory, which helps you to learn further. Moses, could you go to the next slide? So we saw this relevance of universities, and we saw that we should really focus ourselves on this learning design, making sure that that learning experience is perfect. However, what we find in practice is that very often teachers that have that same inspiration, that same motivation, find that they are not able to actually realize this because the technology that they're using is not designed from a pedagogical perspective. It's often more general technology, which is then used in a combination to try to come up with a really innovative method. However, that doesn't work at scale. If you want to have a smooth experience, if you want to give a course to 50, 100, 500 students and make sure that that learning activity is smooth, then you have to make sure that the technology is designed with that use case in mind. And that's what Fibofoods does. We build pedagogical technology. Could you go to the next slide, Moses? So our objectives is by improving these course designs, we can really contribute to better development, skills development, by improving basically these, what we believe in is we'll move away from this one size fits all traditional setup to much more diverse type of learning activities. So we should also be able to support that diversity in teaching and assessment and pragmatic assessment, you name it. There's going to be a lot of different learning activities. We won't move towards a one size fits all new type of learning. It's going to be much more diverse. So we have to be able to also support that diversity in teaching. And then, of course, this is the element where I originally started with, which is this interaction and connectiveness. You really should feel as a student, not just as a number that's going through a process, but you should feel connected with your peers. You should feel valued, and you should feel seen. But we still have a scalability problem, right? There's still one teacher to n students. So how can we design it such that that still exists? Well, peer learning is a big thing there, but also using technology to make sure that an expert jumps in at the moment it actually matters most for a student. Okay, let's go to the next slide. So our solution, basically what we're doing, as I said before, is we build pedagogical technology. So we have a complete pedagogical LMS tool suite supporting course designs that have a proven effect on student engagement and learning outcomes. So it's not us who come up with these designs, it's designs that are already proven out there in the 70s, 80s, 90s. We knew they work, however, they are hard to organize at scale flawlessly. And that's what we solved. So think about it as a fruit basket full of different fruits, and you as a teacher and instructional designer can choose that tool that fits the use case that you're after, the learning activity that you're after. Could you go to the next slide, Moses? So here is a bit more in-depth overview of all these tools. I won't necessarily go into all of them right away. We have a tool suite, the core reason why we don't only build one tool, but more type of tools is exactly because we want to help facilitate this transition from a one-size-fits-all to much more diverse type of learning designs. And we don't want to do that through a revolution, but through an evolution that requires basically a step-by-step approach. So we should look at where is this teacher in their pedagogical thinking at the moment, and we should offer them the next step, and then the next step, and then the next step, making sure that that gap is not too wide, and that requires modularity. So that's what you see here. Learning activities around peer feedback, activating study material, interactive classrooms, and discussions. Moses, could you go to the next slide, please? So this is how we do it. We take this traditional learning design, which is reading, lecturing, with this type of traditional, so to say, student engagement. We over-exaggerate a little, but just to make a point. And why is this wrong, right? Why does this design not work? First of all, it doesn't work for learning. And I probably don't have to explain you, right? You need that repetition, that active thinking, think about the same problem in different ways for it to really stick in long term. That's one. But two, it's not fun. Learning at the beginning is sometimes a bit sour. You have to go through that thing like, I don't understand it, why? But when you start understanding a new subject, when you start seeing the world in a different light because you learned something, that's when you actually start plucking the fruits of your learning, and it becomes very joyful, and that new subject actually becomes something that engages you. In this learning experience, I have an exam in 2 days. So the moment that I get it a bit, I'll go to the next chapter and have to start over again. So that learning design is not fun at all. So what we do, as said before, if you can go to the next slide, Moses, we take one specific learning activity and then change that into an activity which is much more engaging. And we then have technology to support specifically that use case. Yeah, so just please go through the slides, Moses. As you can see here, what you try to do is you try to look at the design and then see what technology, how the technology fits this pedagogical design. Okay, so I guess this is where I round off, and then please.
Thanks, Ewout. Hello again, everyone. So just to refresh, I'm Dan Hassan. Speaking with instructors is my task at Feedback Fruits, documenting their best practices. And now I'm going to share exactly how we managed to fulfill that by looking not at the whole tool suite, but a specific set of tools, which we call interactive study material. Next slide, please. And before looking at a specific use case of how our partners have implemented these and achieved these desires, this mission that we're driving for, let's just remind ourselves of some of the painful, mundane challenges which can be faced when trying to get students to actually interact with that material and engage with it. So most prominent is that article after article, week in, week out, it can be so boring for some students who aren't intrinsically motivated. They'll be reading assignments as a tick the box exercise, and they'll be getting through material rather than actively engaging with it. And then when it comes to the in-class discussion about the material, you all read it on Monday. Who wants to start the discussion? I think most teachers can tell within a few seconds just how much reading has been going on by that uncomfortable silence. And that's not always the case, of course. Often you do see students or groups of students who've clearly engaged with the material and even discussed it amongst themselves. But how can you get more students to do what you expect of them with this course material and these assignments? And how can you be there, even if not in person, to guide them and share your expertise? And how can you still keep an overview of that progress, as complex as it can get for larger and larger groups? Next slide, please. Well, let's frame these questions another way. What pedagogical design needs to be in place to see these positive pedagogical outcomes actually occur? Well, interactivity and collaboration are key. If those can happen outside of class, still as a group with a sense of a learner community, all the better. And we're going to show you just how we can use these foundations to achieve these results, that students can understand the material better and use that as a basis to develop these higher order cognitive skills. Framed in terms of Bloom, understanding comes before applying, analyzing, and evaluating. And if you can get students to understand the material first, you're paving the way for them to be able to take it that next level. And when students start to get into the swing of that, the effect on their motivation is astounding. They feel like the agent in their own learning, and there's that's no longer a scary thing, that autonomy. Their drive will carry them forwards as they build that confidence and motivation. And what happens for one will happen for more, giving students the right platform, the right interface for those interactions, and that learning trajectory to happen is beneficial to them on so many levels. And many students, especially from my generation, have grown up with YouTube comments, internet forum boards, online discussion threads, and digital communication as the norm. So these interfaces and communication ideas, liking, replying, commenting, they're the basis for now how we communicate online, right? And if we can leverage that design for a learning environment and not just a YouTube, TikTok video, minimizing the cognitive load of having to learn a whole new system of communication is definitely something we want to go for. And with all of this, you should see the efficiency of teaching increase, right? Good templates for these activities and these setups are inspiration to peers and colleagues in that institution and everywhere else. And we see a lot of interest in our tools coming from the innovators, the ambassadors who've used them right, sometimes even better than the ways we ourselves are intended. And that's what I try to do myself, find these key users and really share their stories and promote their best practices. Next slide, please. Yes, some of the features of interactive study materials are listed here, but I won't go into detail because my wonderful colleague Moses will show you in the field what they look like. I'll just mention that one on the top right, student progress visualizations or learning analytics. So here, this is a feature, you're going to see it for yourself what it looks like, where you can see as an instructor in the activity overview, per student, how many comments and replies have been made, per student, what sort of interaction has happened. And this means that in whatever size your class is, you have this visual one glance overview of all of that information. Analytics, when used right, can be so fundamentally useful to improving and understanding course design. Next slide, please. So to contextualize some of these features a little bit, in this static screenshot, which we're going to elaborate very soon on afterwards, you have the document in question on the left in the main interface. You can see next to it comments on certain parts of highlighted text. And then on the right, you can see the overall annotations column, which is something like a timeline for all activity which has been produced both by students and teachers on this document. I'm really excited to see Moses's demo so he can explain in depth what this looks like and what it feels like when you're actually inside the program. But for now, next slide, please. I want to talk about Texas A&M International University, one of Texas's independent state universities, who used interactive documents in a core curriculum first-year course called Learning in a Global Context, a general academic skills course, in other words, mandatory for all majors. And that started right at the beginning of most students' academic journeys. Now with individual writing, class discussions, small group work assignments, the question was how to get students to follow this normal planned learning trajectory designed for face-to-face mind into a fully online environment due to COVID, of course. And unfortunately, the native LMS Blackboard, which they were using, wasn't really equipped to facilitate these sorts of collaborative learning discussions in a way. If you know Blackboard, you know they do have a discussion thread which functions and aesthetically relates to many internet forum boards, but it's not the most streamlined. It's not the most synchronous learning environment. It's a little bit antiquated. So these features that they really needed, they were just missing. Could you go to the next slide, please, Moses? Just to refresh you on this approach, we can look at it from three angles, right? For the students, they need to be able to work in groups and individually to look at academic papers and develop these skills. For the teachers, they need to be able to generally give guidance on the activity, both in instructions and how they go about telling students what they actually need to do in the assignments, and also by in the document itself, say they have to read a scholarly article and look for the structure, the introduction, identify where the methods begins, identify what you think the abstract was about, make a small comment here. The teacher can then go into that text, make this comment in line in the document, and allow students to approach this in a way where if they have questions, if they have doubts or worries about the activity, or about the content rather, sorry, they can automatically inside of the activity voice those concerns, reply to these comments, ask for help inside of that, even in an asynchronous matter. And the teachers need to be able to guide that process, and also they need to be able to monitor how it's going, both within the interface and using the student analytics we talked about. And so the tool should obviously address these things. And again, Moses is going to show you how that's going to look. But for now, let's look at the results of this use case. Could I have the next slide, please? The biggest thing was that the instructor actually said in the before and after picture, after using our tools, the general ability of the students to show their understanding of these academic papers had increased. In fact, they remarked that the student engagement had never been higher, which is something, of course, we love to hear. And it is difficult to build a before and after picture with the confounding factor of COVID. That obviously has a huge effect on how students are going to be able to perform before and after, totally transforming their learning environment. But the fact is that even after the challenges of COVID, even after moving to a fully online environment, they were still able to see their highest performance yet. Students were expressing themselves more about the material, having been given a chance to do so in this asynchronous environment in their own time. And also they were able to see each other's work. And this is possible from those specific inline questions that direct guidance and the ability to actually, as a teacher or student, reply to those questions and comments. And of course, in an interface that makes sense, liking comments, replying to threads, etc. Next slide, please. So to paraphrase the instructor, finally, I'm sorry, this text is a little bit light, isn't it? That's poor accessibility on our side. I do apologize, but I'm going to paraphrase them anyway. These tools didn't just meet their expectations for a tool, they exceeded them. Now, students, even in this difficult new environment we talked about, they were engaged more with the material. They could demonstrate that they could perform well, even compared to their previous setups. And of course, that's just what we want to hear. So next slide is just the sources that I've used to tell you what I've told you. And now I'm going to ask if there's any questions so far in the chat, or you can unmute. In any case, I'll pass over to Moses for the demo next. So if you do have any questions about the features, what it looks like, maybe you can wait until the demo and then we can have a Q&A at the end. It's up to you. If you've got anything burning, I would love to hear it. But thank you for listening. Okay, I think Moses, you can take it from here.
Give us 1 second. We're going to share the correct screen. It keeps taking me back. We'll close it. Here we go. Can we all see my screen? Give us a little nod.
Yes.
Yes, great. All right, so what we're going to be doing, we're going to be having a quick look first in the student perspective in a Canvas environment, and then we're going to take it over and go to the teacher perspective also in a Canvas environment. If you have any questions, feel free to unmute, write something in the chat box, and we'll try and get to it at our earliest convenience. So with no further ado, as you can see here, I am logged in over here in the corner as Georgia. We have gone to our assignments and we have selected the interactive document here. So for usability purposes, we have the option here to go full screen, which allows us to drown out all of the extra noise and get in here and focus on the tool and the task which is at hand. So as we can see up top, we have a chronological order of a step-by-step process for what we need to complete as a student. So we can see that our teacher up top has written our instructions to please read the excerpt and answer the questions. They will be graded. Step number 2 will be to then read the document. So we are going to then open our document. And this is a visualization of what you were seeing before with Dan's screen, except now we can move around and we can scroll. So as you can see on the left side, this is a PDF document which has been uploaded by the teacher, from which now the rest of the class, the students and the teacher are able to interact on. So as you can see on the left side, we have specific parts of text which are selected by students who have then started discussion threads. So in this situation, we can see that the text on the right side by Olivia Johnson is in relation to this small portion of text here on the left. On the right side, we can see a bar, which shows us where all of the activity has taken place. So where all of these white dots are where the students have placed discussion threads. So if we go to our first one here, we'll go to Olivia Johnson. This opens up and we can see all of the comments and all of the discussion which has taken place with regards to this specific comment. We can upvote, we can reply, we can also record our voices and an attachment into this if this is how we want to reply. In this case, this is a recording.
Let's give this a try. Hello, this is such a great question. Thank you for asking it.
This is me recording this a few weeks ago. I thought that'd be funny to play for you so you can hear me leaving a voice comment from the past. But here again, we can write replies. If I want to select a different question or a comment discussion, we can go here and so on. Now, from this right side, we can also sort the different types of contributions which have taken place. So we can sort by the latest activity, the location, the upvotes, most comments, and the question cards, unanswered as well as answered. So in this case, we'll go to the one with the most comments. This is our top comment by Olivia Johnson. But if we want to see any of the unanswered question cards from ourselves, we can see all of this lined up as well. Which ones have been answered correctly, which ones not. But now we'll get to the question card. So as you can see on the right side, we have locks. So we have the dots for discussion threads and a lock for the question cards. So if we go to this lock, we can see that this is an open question which has been posted, in which we can see the correct answer as well as my answer, as well as the answer of all of my peers. So we can see Maxwell wrote all connected to the subject. Now you can see that some of them are labeled correct, some are labeled incorrect, and this one here is also labeled 50% correct. Now in the situation of a open question, we have enabled the student to self-reflect and self-assess their own answers based on the question. So this allows it to take a bit of that extra burden of work off the teacher and allows the students to then once again reflect on the answer, to then also go and check the text to continue their learning process. Now in the situation of a multiple choice question, such as this one here, close this, we can see that I have answered this correctly, woohoo, with A. And again, we can see, yeah, so we can see that we've got our 5% of the grade earned. Now we continue. As you can see, these locks here have been opened up because we've answered the question, but now I want to take you down here to the locked lock. Now in this case, which was the case for all the rest of these locks as well, there is a question break. So in this case, the student will not be able to continue reading the text or the document which is at hand until they have answered the question. So for example, if we had this one up here, the rest of the text would be invisible until the student had then answered the question. So in this case, we can see, again, I have to select the correct answer, and I really don't know the answer. So this is going to be a 1 in 3 guess. So let's cross our fingers. I'm going to go with B. Submit our answer. Hey, all right, I was correct. Surprising. No, so you can see we've got it correct. And because we've got it correct, we can now continue, and we can now see the rest of the text in this document. Now that's it for the student view for the document. Now we will take it back to here. So now we can see that the in-document activities which have to be completed would be to view the documents answer the question cards, join the discussion, and add our own contributions, from which we can also see our own progress. So we can see that I've completed the viewing, I've answered the question cards, added my contributions, but I have not joined enough discussion threads, all of which plays into my grade at the end, which we can see down here. You can see the amount of points which have been rewarded for each of the specific tasks within the document. So for viewing the document, all the way down to the scores on the question cards. Now we'll take a 30-second pause here just to have a quick look at the chat box to answer any questions we have on this part. Let me go into the chat box. Can you see how much time the student spends within the reading assignment, or just whether they have answered the questions or not? Yes, I will get to that. Is this the hypothesis? No, this is the interactive document from the student. So this is simply a document which the teacher has uploaded for the students. This is an embedded tool in Canvas. So Beth, to answer your question, I think it's best if we move into the teacher perspective. You're welcome, Leilonda. Let's move on. I'll stop the share for just one moment to take you to the teacher. Okay, let's have some thumbs up. Are we doing okay? Can you see my screen? I see a thumb, which means we're good to go. So now we are in the teacher view. As you can see, this is again the Canvas environment. We will go to the same activity that we had, which is the interactive document. We will wait for it to load. Once again, we can select our full screen option here. So once again, to answer the question of, I'm sorry, I closed the chat box so I can't see your name. We can see the overall student progress for who has started viewing, the average answers. We have the statistical analysis for our students. This is something that we can download into a CSV file or into an Excel file, which can then be added to a portfolio, for example, at the end of the course. Now, if we continue, these are the instructions which I have posted myself. And now we get to the document. Here again, we are now in the teacher mode, where we can again see the same as before, this document with all of the student comments. And then if I want to answer the question, for example, Matthew has answered, or he has asked a very good question, I can reply to his question, say, great question, here is your answer. And then we send. As you can see, as Dan was mentioning before, this is in quite a similar formatting and usability to a lot of the social media platforms which we have, which again allows the students to have less cognitive efforts in order to consume the content which has been placed. As a teacher as well, I'm able to delete specific comments if there's content which we don't want there. We can also see the statistics of our questions. So let's have a look here. We can see who has gotten what correct, who has skipped the question. Now let's have a quick look at the chat box. Maybe we have some more questions. Oh, Dan's answering them. Thanks, Dan.
There's a question from Leilonda about how to make the interactive document. Would you mind elaborating a little bit on that question, please?
Yeah, no problem. So the way this would work is, as an embedded tool in Canvas, you would then go to select an external tool, upload the Feedback Fruits tool, in which case you would have the option to select what kind of format you would like to upload the document. So this could be PDF form, Word form. There's a few other forms, but I will get to that in the next part. In which case then you then are able to add in the specific questions. You are then able to add comments. You're also able to add the criteria. This is all something that I'll get to after we exit this document. So I think that's a temporary answer to a question which will fall into the flow of this demonstration. So we exit our document. And we can see here. So I can decide when to close the activity. I can set a date. I can set time. I can close it now. We can see the activities which have been completed inside with question cards, discussion threads. And last but not least, we can see all the data analytics for our student participation for this assignment. So we can schedule the publish date, publish the grades, and again, we have a nice overview of our student progress. Yes, D2L does have the same feature. So everything is almost the same. There's a few small details in the end, which are different, but in general, you will be seeing virtually the same exact thing with all the different learning platforms, D2L, Moodle, Blackboard, etc. You're welcome. Now, as you can see, we have finished with this part. Now we'll move to the last part, which will answer, I believe, Lelander's question, how to make the interactive document. So if I choose edit, here we can see that we are editing this introduction. We can change the file. And we can also alter the different grading for our document. But here we have some of the more customizable settings which we like. So if we want the students to download the material, yes, we can. We can have contribution separations for specific groups. You can also integrate the specific groups which are pre-existing in Canvas as well. So in this case, we can allow discussion threads, question cards, anonymity, the opening and closing of the activity, and more. Now, if we move our way down, we can see the grading. Again, we can decide how many points are going to the specific weighting. In this case, we have decided to give 0 points for specific aspects. Yeah, I believe that this is the end. If we get back to the end, we can also make it a pass-fail grade. So in the end, you can see that there are many different types and sorts of customizations available for the tool. It is simply up to you to decide which is most fitting for your course design and for the for your class. So we have Angela Munoz asking, what kind of access or subscription do we need to start using this technology? That is a good question. So Dan, do you want to take this one?
What sort of subscription is necessary? These tools are made available on a per institution basis. We do sometimes individual pilots or walkthroughs with teachers. In fact, Moses, you do more of that than me. But the idea is that your tech support, your learning support, your IT support, your communications at your institution will book a meeting with us, determine what sort of use cases and tools and scenario is necessary. And then I think we move into production, into staging, and into trying these things out.
Yeah, so I'm actually just having a look at the time. We have 7 more minutes here. So if any more questions, so the way it works is we work with, if you're interested, you can get in contact with me or one of my colleagues, and we can set up a discussion to see where you see the most applicable situation for your classroom, in which case we demonstrate the tools as such. We can set up a sandbox environment. We also offer a piloting phase in which we have a piloting team which is able to set up key performance indicators, to set up workshops to help walk your teachers through the learning process for all of these different tools to make this transition as smooth as possible for integration into your university. This is a short overview. Do we have any more questions? We'd love to answer them.
I guess just as a sort of rounding up a remark, Moses, thank you very much for this presentation. Dan, thank you very much for this use case. I think we consider ourselves to be